History education matters. What is it? How do we do it? And why on earth should anybody care about it? I've been working and teaching in history education for 30 years now, nearly, in September anyway. I'm passionate about it, and it upsets me when history is diminished, when kids don't understand what it's for, when the curriculum doesn't reflect history's potential, and also when the things history should be able to do don't happen. What do we know about what children think about history? That's my first question. I want you to try and cast your mind back to when you were children and when you were studying it. We don't know very much about it, and that's the first thing I want you to reflect on, because we don't ask children very often. When we do ask them, they can say some quite disturbing things. For example, in a 2005 study asking children what history was for, here is one of the things that they said. History is there to fill up a space on our timetable. History is there to learn about the mistakes dead people made. I just want you to reflect on that. And my favorite is the third quotation. It's there because they think we might enjoy it. These quotations aren't typical. They don't cover all children. There are plenty of children in this study, and more generally, who really like history and really enjoyed it. But I'm interested in the kids who don't get it. And I'm interested in understanding what we can do to engage those students and to help them value what they're doing in their history lessons. What should we do then, and how might we engage them? The answer that our politicians offer us is a national story, typically. If only there was more positive story about the nation in history, children would like it more. That's the proposition. I'm not convinced by this, and for two reasons. One of them is I don't think that positive national story actually is history. There's a more fundamental reason, though, why I don't agree with this idea that all would be well if we simply told people stories. And that's partly from my own experience and partly from working with my own kids. So I grew up in the 1980s. And in the 80s, it was the period of Thatcherism, the period of the Falklands War, the period of the miners' strike. There was a lot of history around, a lot of stories being told. Personally, I didn't find any of them really interesting. It didn't engage me very much. I was more concerned at the time with music, with the things I was buying, with the kind of identity I was constructing through my consumption. The national narrative passed me by. I have 3 children, and I'm pleased to say one of them is doing a history degree. But none of them really get excited by the idea of the national story. It isn't what they get up in the morning to hear about. What can motivate children? What clues do we have that would help us? 10 years ago, I was involved in evaluating an oral history project conducted in school in the north of England. Through this project, girls in the school conducted oral history focused on women's lives in their own community. By all accounts, and certainly by what they told me, they found this very, very interesting and very stimulating and inspiring. Why is this? Part of it was their teacher. They had a passionate teacher driving the project, and that's essential to all education. Part of it was the role they had. The girls were actively investigating. They were interviewing women. They were asking them questions. They were central to the whole thing. Not only that, what they were looking at was their own community, so there was a direct connection to their lives. And also, as well, there was a sense of relevance. So they were asking women about their experiences, and this was something they could connect to. And many of the issues that the women were discussing were the issues that mattered to them. So perhaps there's an example here, perhaps there's something we can learn from about making history powerful for young people. And there are lots of signs also in what they said that would support that. So when I talked to them about it, here are some of the things they said. History was about people like them. It made them proud of their community. They also said, though it's not written down there, that they'd never known before that history was about their community. They thought history was about London, history was about men, history was about people who were rich. And also the fact that they were actively involved in doing the research, that was a key thing. So I think there's a clue here about how you can make history powerful for students. And I think there are lots of good signs in our culture, in our history education at the moment, that these things are working and that there's improvement. Since 2020, in particular, for example, we've had an increase in resources that are relevant to many of our students' lives. And I'm just taking one example here, one theme. Books like David Olusoga's book for children is an example of an excellent resource. There are more training opportunities for teachers than there used to be to make the history curriculum diverse. And also, as well, teachers are taking those opportunities and adopting those curriculum options. And this is a study published only last week that shows that. Okay, so one answer then to the question that I'm posing is history can be made to matter if you make it relevant to children and if you help it connect with their lives and give them an active role. There's much more to be said, however, I think, to really capture the potential of history. I think we live in quite challenging times. And this graph, which I don't know whether you've seen it before, but I mean, it sums it up for me. This is world population in the last 12,000 years. And the last 12,000 years are the period of the Holocene, the period in which farming became widespread, the period, if you like, in which the way of life that we have now became possible because there was a surplus of food. And what's very striking about this is not very much happens for most of these 12,000 years. It's only in the last 1,000 years that you begin to see change in population in the world, and more specifically in the last 250, since the Industrial Revolution, that you start to see significant change. But the really striking thing, I mean, it's quite astonishing to see it, is what happens in the last 50 years. Population goes literally off the graph, right? We've got a kind of right angle to the rest of human history, a dramatic, very dramatic period of change. And you can duplicate this graph for deforestation, for fossil fuel use, for all sorts of other indicators of the trouble that this actually poses for our ways of life. In a word, this is unsustainable, this level of growth, particularly if you project it forward. We've known that from what ecologists have told us. We've known that from our own experience in the last few years, for example, as the planet has been burning in Brazil, in Australia, in Portugal, and in our own country here in England last year, with record temperatures that were killing people and were breaking records set only a few years before. We've known that this is an unsustainable situation also because of the coronavirus. A pandemic of that nature was long predicted. And when it came, it was no surprise. But what a devastating experience for our health, for our communities, for our psychology. There are lots of reasons then to think that we're in difficulties with our way of life and with the current predicament in history. To go back to periods of time, what we can say is that the last 12,000 years, the Holocene, the period of farming, is in a sense coming to an end. We have a new, unpredictable, unanticipated epoch, the Anthropocene, in which humanity is reshaping the planet and, in fact, putting life on the planet in certain hazard. Where in the history curriculum do we discuss that? Here are some textbooks for the English national curriculum. These are political stories, short-term stories about one country by and large. They don't cover the kinds of issues that we need to address. So far, my proposition is that history is important and powerful and can give us insights into our lives, and that we need to engage children in it, and that to achieve this, we need to address their concerns, be relevant, engage them actively, but also discuss the big issues of our time. If we do all that, have we done enough? I think there's a final crucial element missing, and that's what I'm going to address now. We've got natural problems in our world, but we also have narrative problems. Since the financial crash, for example, in particular, a certain kind of politics has spread, a politics depending on a certain kind of narrative, a narrative that poses us against them, that asks us to believe, if only it was so simple, that most of the difficulties in our world can be explained by blaming another group. We can see these narratives in England, in America, in many countries. How can we educate our young people so that they can become resistant to this sort of story? How can we help them be skeptical when a simple story is told to them? In history, what you can do is you can focus on what we know about the past. You can focus on history as a discipline that constructs knowledge. That's a great thing to do. That's a powerful thing to do. It helps people ask questions about the things they're told. But I don't think it's enough. I think what we need to do is focus on the range of stories that children are presented with and give them the tools to think critically about them, in the hope they'll have the narrative competence to challenge simplistic stories when they're presented to them. I'm going to give you one example from English history. In 1819, in Manchester, there was a massacre, and it's called the Peterloo Massacre, an ironic comment on Waterloo and the battle there. In history, this is the kind of thing we study all the time. We study academic narratives about Peterloo, the facts, the arguments, the reasoning. But I think what children need to do also, as well as that, is understand many other ways in which history is represented. For example, to stick with Peterloo, a graphic novel was produced in 2019, the bicentenary of the event. Here it is. What's the difference between the graphic account and the historical account? What are the strengths and limitations of both? There was also a film in 2018. How do films work? How do they differ from graphic novels and from academic historical arguments? Children need to know. How is this history used in politics, in everyday life, in debates about who we are and who we could become? And the answer is, this event was referenced quite a lot. So I think helping children understand that is important. Finally, there's the question of memory. Again, we've become very aware of this in these debates about statues that have happened recently. What gets remembered and what gets forgotten? This massacre in 1819 was not commemorated in Manchester until 1972. That's a long time in which to ignore a significant event in your city. Having been commemorated for the first time in 1972, it's now had 3 monuments in rapid succession. This is the 2007 one, and you can see it's a very small plaque. And here is the 2019 memorial. You can go and stand on this, it's much bigger, it's much more obvious. Why do certain things get forgotten? Why are certain things remembered? Why do monuments go up and come down? That's another kind of question, I think, that opens up the politics of representation for students. And we should be helping them understand those questions as well. So, to summarize, my vision for history education is something like this. We need our history lessons in schools to be relevant to the needs of children, to talk to them, to help them understand the world they live in. We also need it to be global in scope. National story is not a way to understand the problems of our time, and also the opportunities. Both are global. It has to be at scale. The Anthropocene, the Holocene, these cannot be understood over 400 or 500 years by only looking at one country. We need history that's diverse and inclusive, that brings in the stories of all the students in your class. And in London, often there are 48 languages in a class, but also that reflects the diversity of our world. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we need a critical approach to history. Children need to ask questions about the stories they are told. And they also need to ask questions about the knowledge they learn, so they can help use it, perhaps, to help build a more sustainable and more humane world. That's me. Thank you.